Welcome in, friends. Thank you for coming back tonight. And if you've only just found this place, thank you for that too. However this finds you, out on a long road with the dark coming down, or in some quiet corner at the end of a long day, or already halfway into sleep, there is nothing you need to do now but listen. Let the breath go long, and the shoulders come down, and set the day outside the door. It will keep till morning. Before we start, the same quiet promise as always. There will never be an ad on this show. Not one, not ever. Nothing here will interrupt you, or startle you, or ask you to sit up. The only thing that keeps that promise alive is you. A quiet follow, a kind word passed along, a mention to one other tired soul who might like it here. Small things, keeping a small lamp lit. I want to begin with a death that never happened. You may know the picture, even if you have never once gone looking for it. A great tank of water and glass, a man lowered into it upside down, his ankles locked in the lid. A curtain drawn across, the crowd counting the seconds. And then the seconds run too long. Something has gone wrong inside the tank on this one night at last, and the greatest escape artist who ever lived cannot get out, and the water he had beaten 1,000 times closes over him, and that is how Houdini dies. Drowned inside his own most famous machine. It is a terrible, fitting, almost beautiful ending, and most of us carry some version of it. And it is not true. None of it. It never happened. That whole scene, the tank, the failure, the drowning, was invented, out of nothing, for a Hollywood film in 1953, with Tony Curtis playing Houdini. And it was so satisfying, so much more just than the truth, that the world simply kept it. Here is the truth, and it is quieter, and in a way it is sadder. And by the end of tonight, I think it will mean more to you than the myth ever did. Harry Houdini died in a hospital bed. In Detroit, on the afternoon of Halloween, 1926. A virus in his blood, an ordinary illness his extraordinary body could not escape. The man who had slipped out of every chain and cell and straitjacket anyone on earth could devise, who had been buried and frozen and bound and lowered into rivers, was undone in the end by his own appendix. There was no tank, there was no water, there was only a body, at last, that would not open. And that gap, between the death we remember and the death that happened, is the whole of the man, in miniature. Because Houdini spent his entire life escaping things, and the one thing he could never escape, and reached for hardest, and never once got free of, was not a lock at all. It was grief. So the story I want to tell you tonight is not really the story of a magician. I know that sounds strange, because the magic is the part everyone knows, the name that turned into a word, the thing you say when you wriggle out of a tight spot. You Houdini your way out. But the tricks in the end are not the point of him, any more than Sherlock Holmes is the point of the man who wrote him. Houdini made a character the way a novelist makes a character, a caped, defiant, unbindable figure called Houdini, and he wore it so well and so long that it swallowed the man inside. And the man inside is the one worth meeting, a rabbi's son, a boy who kept running away and coming back, a husband who married a girl he'd known 3 weeks and stayed married 32 years, a son who loved his mother past all reason, and underneath all of it, under the illusions, under the whole business of deception he built his life upon. A person who wanted, more than he wanted anything, one real thing he could hold on to, one connection that was true. So let us go back to the beginning, the actual beginning, and walk the whole life through, in order, the way he lived it. Not the escape artist, the man who wanted to believe. He was not born in America, and he was not born on the day he told everyone he was born. The world knew him as Harry Houdini, born in Appleton, Wisconsin, on the 6th of April, as American as the 4th of July, and he insisted on it his whole life. He was born Ehrich Weisz in Budapest, in Hungary, on the 24th of March, 1874, and his family crossed the ocean when he was 4, his mother and the children arriving in New York Harbor on a German steamship in the summer of 1878. So the American was Hungarian, and the birthday was invented. But here is the thing about the invented birthday, and it is the first thread of the whole story, so hold on to it. He did not just pick the 6th of April at random. He chose it for a reason he set down plainly in a letter to his brother. "As she always wrote me on April 6th, he wrote, meaning his mother, "that will be my adopted birth date." Think about that for a moment. A man who would lie about the country he was born in, and the year, and the town, anchored his one true chosen birthday, not to any document, not to any fact, but to the day his mother's letter came each year. The one date he kept sacred was the date she reached for him. And there is a small aching possibility underneath even that his mother chose the 6th of April for a private grief of her own, an earlier child, also named Erik, who had died before him. So the day he called his birthday may have been, at its root, the day she remembered a son she lost. Reaching and being reached for, all the way down. The father was a rabbi. Mayor Samuel Weisz, a learned man, a rabbi of the old Hungarian world, who came to Appleton and became that little Wisconsin town's first rabbi at a small congregation, and for a few years the family was poor but settled and whole. And then he lost the pulpit. The old story says he was let go for being too foreign, too slow with his English, a man of the old country outpaced by the new one. And maybe that was part of it. But the more careful reading from people who have gone back through the town records is gentler and more ordinary than that. The congregation was growing, filling up with German families who wanted a rabbi of their own, and the old rabbi and his handful of supporters were simply outnumbered and outvoted. No villain in it, just a congregation outgrowing the man who founded it, and a family tipped, quietly, from getting by into real poverty. They moved to Milwaukee, and then the father took young Erik ahead to New York, the two of them in a boarding house, sending for the others when they could. And here is the image to hold, because it tells you everything about the boy's hunger to be more than what he was. The rabbi, a scholar, a man whose whole life had been the book, ended his days working in a necktie factory, cutting cloth by the piece, his son at the table beside him. A life of learning reduced to piecework. The boy watched his father's dignity worn down to nothing, and he never forgot it. And for the rest of his life, he would take pains to make the old man sound grander than he had been. The same instinct, exactly, that would later invent an American birthplace for himself. The Weisz men rewrote their failures into something they could bear. And when the father was dying, cancer, in 1892, he asked his son for a promise. that the boy would take care of his mother, always. Ehrich swore it, and he kept it past the edge of reason. He called his mother a saint. When she died, he said the mourner's prayer for her every single night for a year, all 365 days. And once, at the height of his fame, he asked to be paid his week's wages in gold coins, and carried them home and poured them out into his mother's lap. Remember that picture, the gold in the lap. We will come back to what it costs a man to love like that. Now, you might expect a rabbi's household and a son making his living by trickery to be at war. It is the story people assume. The pious father scandalized, the illusionist son cast out. But the record does not show that war. There is almost no evidence of a rupture at all. Quite the opposite. Houdini stayed reverently attached to where he came from his whole life. He kept his father's Hebrew Bible and treasured it. During the war, he founded a little society for the sons of rabbis who had gone into show business. He never once hid or denied that he was a Jew, a rabbi's son. So the tension was never between the boy and his family. The tension was inside the boy. A child raised on the sacred, the true, the eternal, who chose to make his living entirely out of the false. A boy of the book, selling illusions. He knew, better than anyone alive, the exact difference between a real thing and a convincing fake, because he sold the convincing fake for a living. Keep that blade sharp in your mind. It is the blade the whole story eventually turns on. Even as a boy, he was already remaking himself, already reaching for a bigger name. Around 12, he ran away from home, maybe more than once, heading, of all places, toward Galveston, Texas, and traveling under a name that was not his, Harry White. We know almost nothing about those runaway days, only that he went, and that he went as someone else. The reinvention was there before the fame, before the magic, before any of it. A poor immigrant boy who could not yet be anyone, trying on a new name like a coat. And when he found the name that stuck, it too was borrowed, and it too rested on a mistake. As a young man, he read the memoirs of a great French conjurer named Robert Houdin and worshipped him, and a friend from the necktie shop told him, wrongly as it happens, because French has no such rule, that if you added an E to the name Houdin, it would mean like Houdin. So Ehrich Weisz became Harry Houdini, a first name softened from the Erie his friends already called him, and a last name built out of a dead Frenchman he admired, and a grammatical error he never checked. The man who would one day make a career of exposing other people's frauds founded his own entire self on a borrowed name and a thing that simply was not true. He did not know that yet, but it was there from the start, the reaching to be more, and the not quite solid ground it stood on. The magic, at first, did not work. He teamed up young with a partner, and then with his brother, in an act called the Brothers Houdini, and their one good trick was a thing called metamorphosis. And I want to pause on it, because of everything he ever did, this one is quietly the truest. Here is how it went. His hands are tied. He is sealed inside a cloth sack, and the sack is knotted, and the sack is locked inside a trunk, and the trunk is roped and padlocked shut. His partner stands on top of the trunk, pulls up a curtain to hide them both for one instant, claps 3 times, and on the third clap, the curtain drops. And it is the partner who is now bound and sealed and locked inside the trunk, and Houdini standing free on top of it. 3 seconds. A whole exchange of places, of bindings, of trust, in 3 seconds. And soon the partner in the trunk was a young woman named Bess. He met her at Coney Island when they were both barely more than children. She was singing in a little act called the Floral Sisters, and it was almost an accident that they met at all. His brother had been courting one of the other girls, and Harry just came along for the evening and left it engaged. 3 weeks. They courted for 3 weeks and got married, and it horrified her mother, a strict German Catholic woman who reportedly called the Jewish magician the devil himself, and would not have him. So there they were, a rabbi's son and a Catholic showgirl, married in a hurry, cut off from her family, with almost no money and each other and a trunk. And they never had children. Bess simply became the act, climbed into the sack and the trunk, and traded places with him, night after night, for 32 years, until the day he died. I don't think it is too much to say it. The trick that made them was a trick that needs 2 people to exchange complete trust inside a locked box, in the dark, in 3 seconds. The marriage was the act, and the act was the marriage. 2 people who only had each other, proving it 8 shows a day. And it was 8 shows a day, or more. For years they lived at the very bottom of the business, the dime museums, the cheap halls, grinding out as many as 20 short performances in a single day for pay that barely kept them fed. He billed himself, in this bleakest stretch, as the King of Cards, a grand, ridiculous title for a young man nobody had heard of, aspiration dressed up as fact. And the card act failed. It never took. And here is a mercy hidden inside that failure, though he could not have seen it then. It was precisely because the cards did not work that he was pushed, reluctantly, toward the thing that did, the escapes. By the end of 1898, he was ready to quit. 6 years in, going nowhere. He printed up a little 16-page catalogue, A School of Magic, and offered to sell every secret he had, the Handcuff Act, Metamorphosis, all of it, to 4 New York newspapers for $20. $20 for everything, and there were no takers. He got exactly 1 student, an elderly businessman. Sit with that a moment. The man who would become the most famous magician in the history of the world tried, at the lowest point, to give the whole thing away for the price of a good dinner, and nobody wanted it. But before the escape saved him, he spent a season doing something the rest of his life would seem designed to bury. In the winter of 1897 and into 98, broke, he and Bess travelled with a medicine show through the Midwest, the kind of travelling company that sold tonics and put on a bit of everything. And there, in the opera house of a little town called Galena, Kansas, Harry Houdini debuted as a spiritualist. A medium. He held séances and took messages from the departed. And he did it the way it is always done, by walking the local graveyards in the afternoon, reading the headstones, learning the town's losses, and then, that night, in a darkened room, delivering those names and those dead back to the grieving people who had loved them, as if they were floating up out of the beyond. He was good at it. He was good at it for grocery money. I need you to hold this fact very carefully, because everything the man later became is built on it. The person who would one day stand up in front of the United States Congress to protect the bereaved from fraudulent mediums had been a fraudulent medium. He knew the whole thing, every rap, every whispered name, every gentle cruelty played on a grieving stranger, because his own hands had done it, in a Kansas opera house, when he was young and hungry and would do anything. He had looked grieving people in the eye and sold them a lie about their dead. He never, ever forgot how that felt. And then, in the spring of 1899, in a beer hall in St. Paul, a man named Martin Beck watched Houdini escape from a pair of handcuffs and did not believe it. The next night, Beck came back with 3 pairs of his own cuffs and challenged him, and Houdini escaped from all 3. And Beck, who ran a circuit of far better theatres, gave him one piece of advice that remade his life. Drop the cards. Make the escapes the whole act. Then he sent a telegram. Houdini pasted that telegram into his diary and kept it, and wrote one line beside it, and the line is the whole hinge of his life. This wire, he wrote, changed my whole life's journey. From $25 in a good week, his pay began to climb. 50, 100, and before long, even after Beck took his cut, toward $400 a week. The king of cards was gone. The man who could not be held was being born. And what he did, once the world was watching, was turn his own body into the instrument. Not sleight of hand anymore. The body itself, bound and submerged and suspended and getting free. There was the milk can, a great metal can filled with water, and Houdini locked inside it, handcuffed, under the lid, behind a curtain. And the posters outside roared the words, "Failure means a drowning death," and the audience was invited to hold its own breath and count. There was the water cell, the one from the myth, built in England for a fortune, all mahogany and glass and nickel, feet locked in the lid, lowered in upside down, the curtain, the escape. And there was the image that became him, a man hanging by his ankles from the side of a tall building in the open air, in a straitjacket, in front of a street packed so thick with upturned faces that traffic stopped, writhing, twisting, working the strapped arms up and over his head, and then the jacket falling away, and the man hanging free, and the roar going up from 10,000 throats. Now, the honest footnotes, because we always tell each other the truth here. He liked to say he escaped the straitjacket by dislocating both his shoulders at will. A gruesome, marvelous claim he put in magazines for years. It was not true. It was advertising. The films show him simply hauling his arms over his head, no dislocation needed, and as one historian dryly noted, a man with Houdini's ego, if he could really pop his own shoulders out on command, would have whipped off his shirt and done it for every reporter in sight. The trick was skill and conditioning, not self-mutilation. But the real cost to his body was worse than the fake one he advertised. A kidney genuinely torn once, when a dock worker cinched a rope tie challenge too hard, a wrist broken in 3 places, an ankle shattered near the end. The danger was partly a poster. The wear on the man was real. And there is one of these escapes, one day of it, that belongs to the true story more than all the rest, because his mother was there. The 7th of May, 1907, Rochester, New York. He leapt, manacled, off a bridge into the canal to settle a wager, and freed himself in about 15 seconds, while 10,000 people watched from the banks, and it was filmed, and the film survives. The oldest moving picture of him in action. But his mother had come to see it. That was rare. She almost never came to the outdoor stunts. And that night, in his diary, the man who would fill pages with boasts and dates and grievances wrote 4 small words, and only 4. Ma saw me jump. The body that had escaped every binding on earth performed, that afternoon, for the one person whose loss would one day undo him. And he wrote it down like a boy. Ma saw me jump. Because 6 years later, she was gone. In the summer of 1913, while Houdini was away on tour across the ocean, his mother had a stroke, and she died. And the man who could get out of anything could not get to her. He was on the wrong side of the sea. They held the funeral back. They waited and kept her, so that her son could cross the water and stand beside her one last time before she was buried. And when he did, he placed in her coffin a pair of woolen slippers, because they were the last thing she had asked him for. I want to just let that sit, quietly, because it is the true center of the whole life, and it needs no decoration. The man who spent every night of his career escaping ropes and locks and sealed containers, who had made his whole name out of the promise that nothing could hold him, stood beside the one person he could not reach, now bound from him past any lock he knew, and put a pair of soft slippers where her feet would be, and let them close the lid. Every binding in the world he could open, not that one. And from that day, something in him turned and went looking. Now, to understand what he went looking for, and the strange war it led him into, you have to understand that he was not alone in his grief. The whole world just then was at the séance table. There was a movement, by then decades old, called spiritualism, the belief that the dead are not gone, that they linger just past the veil, and that certain gifted people, mediums, can reach them. In a darkened room, through raps and knocks, floating trumpets, voices, messages written on slates, a hand moving a pencil that is not the hand's own. It had begun back in 1848 with 2 young sisters in a New York farmhouse who convinced their neighbors that mysterious rappings were a murdered man knocking from beyond, though one of those very sisters, 40 years later, would stand on a stage before 2,000 people and show them all how she had done it, cracking the joint of her own big toe to make the raps, and call the whole thing, in her words, an absolute falsehood from beginning to end. And then, a year after that, she took the confession back. So the movement was muddied from its own cradle, a founder who confessed and recanted and left the world unable to be sure. But by the time Houdini's mother died, and then through the years just after, spiritualism was not a fringe thing. And this is the part we forget. It swept the world because the world had just been broken open by loss on a scale that had never happened before. The Great War killed something like 9 million young men, a grief that was not private but national, whole countries in black, and so many of the lost with no grave to visit, gone into the mud of France with nothing to bury. And right on the heels of the war came a plague of influenza that took tens of millions more. Picture the sheer weight of it. A grief so wide it had no private corner left, almost no family untouched. And here was spiritualism, offering the one thing all those millions most wanted to hear: that the boy was not gone, that he was well, that he was near, that you could speak to him again. It was not the credulous and the foolish who believed. It was knighted scientists. It was a physicist, a man who helped invent the radio, who published a whole book of messages he believed came from his own son, killed at the front, and whose wife wrote simply, "We can face Christmas now." So when Houdini set himself against the mediums, understand what he was setting himself against. Not a con on the gullible, but the comfort of a bereaved world. Which is exactly why what he did was so hard, and so brave, and so easy to hate him for. And at first, he did not set himself against it. At first, he wanted it to be true. Because there was a man, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the very man who created Sherlock Holmes, the great, cool logician of English letters. And Doyle had become spiritualism's most passionate believer on earth, its evangelist, convinced past all argument that the departed still spoke. And Houdini and Doyle became friends, real friends. And the friendship was built, at its root, on the thing they both longed for, the possibility that the veil was thin, that connection survived the grave. The magician who missed his mother and the novelist who had lost so much to the war, drawn together over the hope that death was not the end. For a while it was warm and genuine. And then came a single afternoon that broke it, in 1922, in Atlantic City. Doyle's wife believed she had a gift, that spirits could move her hand across a page, writing messages she did not compose. They sat together, the two couples, and Lady Doyle's hand began to move, and it wrote, page after page, a message, she said, from Houdini's mother. And Houdini sat there and read it, and he could not accept it. And here is why, and it is devastating in its plainness. The message came pouring out in fluent, easy English, and his mother had barely spoken English at all. She was an immigrant, a rabbi's wife, who lived in Yiddish and German. It was headed, at the top of the page, with the sign of the cross, for a devout Jewish woman, a rabbi's widow, who would never in her life have made that sign. And it was warm and full and complete, and never once mentioned that this very day, or near it, was the day she used to write to him, the day he had made his birthday. Everything a real message from his mother would have carried, it did not carry. And everything she was not, it was. Doyle believed it, utterly and sincerely, to his dying day. Houdini could not, and would not, and the friendship never recovered. Two men who wanted precisely the same thing, one more word from someone they had lost, and who broke, permanently, over whether they were allowed to believe they had gotten it. And so the medicine show boy became a crusader. Houdini spent the last years of his life as the most relentless exposer of fraudulent mediums the world had ever seen. He wrote a book about it, laying the tricks bare. He built a private network of undercover investigators who would slip into a town ahead of him in disguise and sit through the séances and catch the methods, and he gave them joke names because even in earnest he could not help the wit. One of his agents worked under the alias Francis Roud, which read aloud is simply F. Roud, fraud. He went, at the end, all the way to the Congress of the United States and testified in support of a law against fortune-telling for money, and demonstrated the tricks right there in the committee room, the great trickster exposing the tricksters by out-tricking them in front of the lawmakers. And he did all of this at real cost, in a country that was overwhelmingly Christian and freshly, deeply bereaved, where telling grieving people that their comfort was a lie made you, to a great many, something close to a monster. But here is what I most want you to see about the crusade, the thing underneath it. It was not, I think, the work of a cold skeptic who found the whole business silly. It was the work of a man who knew exactly how the trick was done because he had done it, who had cold read those graveyards himself, and who could not bear to watch other people's hands do to the grieving what he had once done for grocery money. And it may have been something even more than that, because a man who truly did not care whether the dead could speak does not spend the last decade of his life at séance after séance after séance. He does not weep at a table in Atlantic City. He does not keep saying, as Houdini did, that he would give anything, anything, for one true word from his mother. You can read the ferocity two ways, and we will at the end, but hold the possibility now that the greatest debunker of the afterlife was also, secretly, the person in every one of those darkened rooms who most desperately wanted it to be real. Each fraud he exposed was a door he had hoped, for 1 second, might open, slammed shut again by his own hand. And then, on Halloween, 1926, it ended. Not in a tank, as you now know, but strangely enough, all the same. 9 days earlier, in his dressing room in Montreal, a young college student had asked whether it was true that Houdini could take a punch to the stomach without harm, and, the story goes, began striking him before he had properly braced. Whether those blows caused what came next, or only masked it, is something the doctors and biographers have argued over ever since, and honestly cannot settle, because the answer lies in an appendix that is long gone. What is certain is that his appendix burst, and the infection spread, and no medicine of 1926 could stop it, and on Halloween afternoon, in a Detroit hospital bed, at 52, Harry Houdini died. And of course, the rumors came at once, that he had been murdered, that the vengeful mediums he had spent years exposing had finally silenced him, poisoned him, arranged the blow. Decades later, people would even propose digging up his body to test it, and then quietly let the idea drop. But there is no evidence for any of it, and the plain reading is the true one, and it is the reading he himself would have insisted on. No plot, no vengeance, no dark hand. Just a virus and a body that had escaped everything else in the world, meeting the one thing it could not escape. The man who beat every machine, beaten at the end by his own. But the story does not stop at the grave. And this is the part that would have astonished even him. Because Houdini had left something behind. A code. A secret phrase arranged in advance with Bess in a private cipher only the two of them knew, so that if it were truly possible to send a message back from the other side, he, of all people, the man who knew every fake method there was, would do it for real and prove it in words no medium could have guessed. The phrase was, "Rosabelle, believe." Rosabelle, the little song Bess had been singing the night they met, all those years ago at Coney Island. And believe. Think about what that is from the world's greatest skeptic. He spent his life proving that no one could reach the dead, and then made a careful, secret arrangement to try to do exactly that himself, one last time, for her. A skeptic's trap, or a lover's open hand. We will come to that. And after he died, the mediums came. Of course they came. The very people he had spent his life exposing now lined up to claim they had reached him, that Houdini himself was speaking through them at last. And in 1929, one of them delivered the words, "Rosabelle, believe." And Bess, grieving, ailing, worn down, at first signed a statement that yes, it was the message, the true one, prearranged between her husband and herself. And then the doubt came in behind it, as it always does. The words of that code had already appeared, quietly, in a book published the year before, so anyone who read closely could have learned them. The witnesses on one side swore it was real, the witnesses on the other swore it was a hoax, and the two accounts simply, flatly contradict each other, and never have been reconciled, and never will be. So we do not know. We cannot know. All we know for certain is what Bess did next. Every Halloween, on the anniversary, she held a séance and lit a small light for him and waited. She did it for 10 years. And then, in 1936, she put the light out and stopped and said the line that closes the whole book of him. 10 years, she said, is long enough to wait for any man. So we come, as we always do, to the two ways of holding it. And tonight, for this man above all, I do not think you should choose, and I do not think you can. Here they are, side by side, at equal weight, and then I will let you drift. The first way is that he never believed, not for one moment, and the reaching was love, not hope. On this reading, Houdini knew from his own graveyard walking days precisely how empty the whole business was. His crusade was not wounded faith, but a steady, unsentimental refusal to stand by, while it was done to other mourners as it had nearly been done to him. And the code he left Bess was not a bet on the afterlife at all. It was a test he was certain no one could pass, a final act of debunking aimed at his own death, a way of shielding the wife he was leaving from the people he knew would come to her door with comfort for sale. On this reading, the reaching toward his mother, toward Doyle, toward the veil, was the reaching of a man who wanted exactly what everyone in that grieving decade wanted, and who understood, better than anyone else alive, precisely why he could not have it, and who carried that understanding, and the ache folded inside it, for 13 years, without once letting himself off the hook of the truth. And the second way is that he wanted to believe more than any of them, more than Doyle, more than all the grieving millions, and that the ferocity was the tell. On this reading, a man who did not care does not go to hundreds of séances. He does not weep at the table. He does not spend his last breath saying he would give anything for one word from his mother. He pressed against the medium so hard precisely because each one was a door he had let himself hope, for half a heartbeat, might be real. And the disappointment over and over was unbearable, and so he broke the doors himself before they could break him. And the code was not a trap, but exactly what the word says. Believe. An open hand held out across the dark. And the fact that Bess waited 10 Halloweens for a light that never came is the measure of how badly, how completely, both of them wanted the answer to be yes. On this reading, the great debunker was the most desperate believer in the room. And you know, both of these are built from the very same life. the same graveyards, the same slippers, the same code, the same 10 years. They do not disagree about a single thing that happened. They disagree only about what was in the heart of a man who spent his whole life making sure no one could ever see inside. But underneath both of those readings, there is one thing that never comes up for argument at all. And I think it may be the part of him worth carrying out of tonight. However you read his heart, the record of his hands is identical in both. For the last 13 years of his life, this man stood between people who were grieving and people who were willing to be paid for that grief. And the reason he was so unusually good at it, the reason he could name the method before the table had finished moving, is the one thing about himself he never tried to make disappear. He had sat on the other side of it. A young man of 23 in a Kansas opera house in the winter of 1898, walking the local graveyard in the afternoon with a notebook, copying down the names and the dates and the small carved endearments, and then giving them back that same night, in the dark, to the very people who had put them there, for the price of a room and a meal. He could have let that go quietly. He was, after all, a professional at making inconvenient things vanish, and he had already rewritten his birthplace and his birthday and his own name. He kept it instead. He put it in his own book, in his own words, where anyone who wanted it could find it. There is an old idea about what a person does after that, and every language seems to keep its own name for it. Some call it guilt, and some call it humility, and some call it grace, and some call it peace. And my own suspicion is that it is usually all four of them wearing each other's clothes. The plainest way to say it is that he understood himself to owe something, and he spent the back half of his life paying it. Not to the people he had sat with in Galena, who were long scattered by then and could never have been found, but to whoever was sitting in that same chair now, in some other town, on some other bad night. That tends to be how those debts get settled, almost never back to the one you owe, nearly always forward, to the next one in the chair. He learned, and he repented, and he tired. And the tiredness belongs in the story as much as any of it. In his last year, he was carrying a national tour, a book, a network of investigators, a hearing before the Congress of the United States, and a body that had quietly begun handing him the bill for 30 years of the work. An ankle broken in Albany 2 weeks before the end, and he finished the performance that night anyway, because by then it was the only way he knew how to be. And somewhere along that road, the shape of what he wanted had changed. And I do not think he ever announced it, because people almost never do. The boy who left home wanted more. A bigger name, a bigger crowd, a bigger word for himself than the one he had been given. And he chased it with a hunger that is a little startling to read about even now. The man at the end was working for something much smaller and much nearer. One room, one woman in it. One true thing said plainly, with no method standing behind it. Which is, I think, the ordinary arc of very nearly everybody, only run at speed and lit from the front. Most of us spend the first half of it reaching for more, and somewhere in the second half we find out that more was never quite the thing, that what we were after was here and near and quiet, and mostly already in the room with us. He got there, late and by a hard road, and with a great deal left unfinished. But he got there. Keep them both then. Keep the escape artist you grew up with, the chains, the cell, the impossible body, because that was real, and it was magnificent, and he worked harder for it than almost anyone who ever lived. But keep the other one too, the one underneath, the one this whole night has been about. A rabbi's son who made his birthday out of his mother's letters. A boy who kept taking new names, reaching to be someone. A husband whose greatest trick needed two people to trust each other completely inside a locked box in the dark. A son who poured gold into his mother's lap and put slippers in her coffin and could not, for all his gifts, get to her in the end. The man whose entire life was deception and who wanted, more than he wanted breath, one single thing that was true. He spent his career escaping every binding anyone could build, and the one he never escaped, the one he reached for, right to the last coded word, was not a lock or a chain or a cell. It was the plain human ache of having loved someone and lost them, and wanting, past all reason and all evidence, to hear their voice just once more. Which is not a magician's problem at all. It is everyone's. It is yours, and it is mine. That is why he still reaches us, 100 years on. Not because he could get out of things, because he couldn't get out of that one, the same one none of us can. That is where I will leave him tonight. Not drowned in any tank, not working at anything at all, but sitting quietly on the far side of all his own illusions, a man who wanted to believe. Thank you for spending this hour with me, and with him. Whether it kept you company out on the road, or filled a quiet evening somewhere, or carried you the last soft distance down towards sleep, that is the whole of what it was for, and it was enough. And there is nothing left to work out tonight. The questions can stay exactly where they are. They have been sitting there 100 years already, and they will keep till morning perfectly well without any help from us. So let them sit a while longer. Rest easy now, wherever this finds you. The light will keep till morning. Until next time, friends. Go gently now.